join us. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We're still going to wait a couple more minutes. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dylan Stern with the Delta Science Program, Delta Stewardship Council. Just quickly, I want to introduce our team. So we have Eva Sedaris and Megan Nguyen, who are two amazing Sea Grant fellows working with us. And we have Dr. Jill Harris, whose final day is at the council is today. And then we have quite a few others from the council joining us. And Mina is here to help us capture notes, and Dr. Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers will lead us through today's talks. So again, thanks for joining us. You are here at the inaugural Delta Research Seminar Series, and we have a very exciting seminar planned for you today. Today's theme is the social and historical perspectives on the Bay Delta system, and we are featuring Dr. Stefan Talke and Sean Baumgarten. And just a couple reminders, when you do see the anonymous polls at the beginning and the end of the Zoom meeting, we hope that you will spend just a couple minutes of your time filling it out for us. The purpose is really to continuously improve our events like these, and so thank you in advance for that. Also, please add your name and affiliation in the chat. We really want to get to know everyone, so when you get a chance, please add that to the chat. And I think we'll just wait another minute before getting started.
Sorry, that was errant clicking. That was a preview. Next slide.
Thanks, Jill.
We'll go back to the title slide.
I see people adding their names in the chat. Thank you. Keep it coming. Just another quick minute here. Okay, I think we're ready. Yeah? So please advance, Jill. So let's get started. Thanks again for joining us. This seminar, just so you know, will be recorded and posted to the council's YouTube channel in case you want to share this later on with someone who is unable to attend. So the format for today is that each presenter will have 30 minutes total to present and then to answer questions. We really, really want to encourage participation and discussion, so please write in the chat box. We have a Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and we will promote you for your opportunity to ask a question or to speak. And just another reminder again, if you see the anonymous poll at the beginning and the end of the Zoom, we hope you will take a couple minutes to fill it out. It's really to help us make these events better. So thanks again. And I will now hand it over to our Delta lead scientist, Dr. Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers.
Thank you, Dylan. And I have to agree, this is exciting to see this seminar series kick off. So welcome all. I'm so glad to see so many people chiming in on the chat. Please, we really would like to hear from you. So please do include your name and affiliation in the chat. Let me start by saying that science funding is a core part of the Delta Science Program mission, and the Delta Research Awards is one of the primary mechanisms of that science funding. So the two projects that we're going to be highlighting today were funded by the 2020 Delta Research Awards, and they address critical knowledge gaps identified at the 2017 Science Action Agenda. As an aside, we now are into the 2022 Science Action Agenda, and we're currently soliciting proposals for the next round of Delta Research Award funding and for the Delta Science fellowship opportunity. The purpose of this seminar series is to directly connect scientists and with managers and others who might use the information. So the seminars, again, all 6 are going to be open to the public, all are welcome, and we're especially encouraging conversation among anyone who might use this information. We're going to have time for questions after each presentation. And so please add your questions to the Q&A section you should have a link to that. And we will take your questions, as many as we can, during today's session. One of the ways that we track Delta Science here at the Delta Science program is through the Delta Science Tracker. So I want to encourage you to check this out. It's a tool that we use to improve coordination and collaboration among science activities in the Delta. And with that, I want to also highlight some upcoming Delta Science events. July 12th, if you haven't heard already, we have a workshop called Science for Communities. And this workshop in particular showcases projects created by partnerships between Delta community-based organizations and scientists, addressing topics as broad as air quality, harmful algal blooms, homelessness, and the human right to water. The event is in Stockton and it's free and open to the public. So please consider attending in July 12th. We also have a draft essay on grand challenges facing the Delta. It's open now for public comment. And we're looking forward to hearing back from people, I believe, over the next 60 days. The abstract, the due date has moved. You might have remembered it was June 3rd. Now it's June 10th for abstracts for the Bay Delta Science Conference. And lastly, the Delta Science Fellowship opportunities, those applications are due June 24th. So lots of action happening into the future. But let's go back and talk about some projects that address social and historical perspectives with the 2020 Delta Research Award funding. The theme of the day is those perspectives, and these 2 projects integrate historical data and community engagement for modern applications. The first project is by Stefan Talke and colleagues from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and they uncovered, collected, and analyzed historical habitats and infrastructure data to better understand sea level rise and flooding currently and projections. This research addressed the Science Action Agenda, Science Actions 1, 2, and 4, you can see described below. So investing and assessing the human dimensions of natural resource management. Number 2, capitalizing on existing data through improved science synthesis. And lastly, improving understandings of interactions between stressors, managed species, and communities. You'll also notice that you got a pop-up poll. I think we all did. So that's something that you should be filling in as they pop up. Finally, the second project that you're going to hear about was, it's by Letitia Grenier and colleagues at San Francisco Estuary Institute. It improves our understanding of community priorities and parts of the Delta that are especially vulnerable to adverse changes. Their research addressed also Science Actions 1, investing and assessing the human dimensions of natural resource management, and also Science Action 3, which is developing tools and methods to support and evaluate habitat restoration. That's the second one. So we're going to start with Stefan, and I believe we have his slides queued up. So let's transfer to Stefan. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Welcome. I'm glad there's so many people here. So our project was to look at sea level rise and potential flood changes in the Delta using archival and historical water level records. I'll tell you what that means. But what's really interesting, I think, is, there's a long history in the Delta, starting with the gold rush, going into, building levees and dredging, the harbor down to Stockton. And all of those have their influence on water level records. And so what I'm going to show today is really just scratching the surface. But what we're interested in also is what's going to happen in the future. And what is the sea level rise? What are going to be climate change effects? Are things like tides and extremes shifting? Is there evidence for that? So anyway, that's what we're talking about. So if you could move forward. So it's kind of a truism, but we know that the delta is influenced by both river flow and by coastal processes. And there's often very strong gradients. So if you go down the river from Sacramento, that's mostly river influence. And then by the time you get to Rio Vista or Antioch, there's a substantial coastal influence. And sometimes these gradients are very, very sharp. And if you want to understand water levels and climate change effects, you need to have some sort of way of assessing and using all of those different factors. And so that's what we have done. I won't go into the details, but there is a paper from last year that you can take a look at if you're interested. Please go forward. And so our approach is there's actually a very unique and not very well known data set in the Delta of over 100 water level gauges. The scientific community doesn't really know about it because it's stuck in state databases, not in like NOAA databases. And then there's also a lost and forgotten data set from before 1982, where the state and actually also the Coast and Geodetic Survey were making water level measurements, mostly starting in the 1920s, but continuously. And then there's also some records from the 1800s. And all of that gives us unique insights into the system. Next slide. And so here's just some examples of the data. This is a Bulletin 130 from the state. So if you click forward, there will be a number of different examples of data that you'll see from various time periods. So you could just click forward. Some of the records are in the Department of Water Resources. Some of them are in the National Archives. And we've taken pictures of all these records. And here you can see me taking pictures in West Sacramento. And then there are students that digitize these records. There's a lot of quality assurance that has to happen. There's a lot of trying to figure out, well, what was the zero of the gauge? How does that relate to the modern data, et cetera? So there's a lot that goes into this. Next slide, please. And in terms of the agenda items, I think this was already covered. But by looking at these historical records, we can take a look at historic extreme events. We can see how management decisions like building dams or dredging channels actually influenced water levels. Click forward, please. Again. And through analyzing these data, we're actually synthesizing data that hasn't necessarily been looked at as much as it should be. Next, click forward, please. We're creating new tools in a way that we can actually use river flow and coastal processes to get a better interpretation of how water levels change and where. And click to the next one, please. And then we're also, cleaning up some of the existing data and hopefully making this available to people so that we can get a better idea of what the future holds. Next slide, please. So in terms of results, on the right-hand side, you see some of the stations that we have been working with. You can see the start dates and the end dates of the archival records. Some of them go back into the 1800s. A lot of them start in the 1920s. Our original goal was to find and recover and digitize 1300 years. We've exceeded that. We're at about 1900, and there's still some on a volunteer basis, students that are actually entering this data. There's some records that were not found and may still exist. That's something to look for in the future. Next slide, please. And what does it look like? So if we take a look at monthly water levels after we've done QA, this is what we see, right? We see a bunch of annual fluctuations. We see year-to-year variability, like you can see 1983, 1998 were really high water years. The cyan is the NOAA gauge in San Francisco. And so you can see there's a commonality between what's happening in the Delta and what's happening at the coast. And so coastal processes are important. You also see that there's an amplification that goes on, and that's because of river flow, right? So when there's a El Nino event, for example, there's often river flow, and so you can see that in the Delta data as well. And you can see, especially in the top graph, you'll see a separation that happens over time between the different data sets, and that's because there's different sea level rise rates at these locations. So next slide, please. And so here's just some examples of some of the analysis we're doing. And you can see the year-to-year variability. A lot of that is river flow, but some of it is coastal processes, and you can see the trends that are fit to it. Next slide, please. And we also see, if we dig into it, we can also see how tides are varying over time. And those sort of, you can see that, in fact, there's like a downwards trend in a lot of places. And that's actually curious. That's not what we expected. In many, many places in the world, you actually see an amplification in tide range. So like the difference between mean high water and mean low water. We see the opposite happening, and that's not really explained yet. But it does matter, because if the tides are going down, that means, you know, the extreme water levels are also going to be influenced potentially. And you can see these sort of outliers on the low side. What happens is when there's a lot of river flow, the tide range actually goes down, and in some cases actually disappears. So those are not bad data. That's actually a signal. Next slide, please. The main result that we have, and this is in a paper recently published, is that sea level rise is very high in the Delta. And in fact, in some places, 3 to 4 times the amount that's happening in San Francisco. And so anywhere where you see a dark coloring, that is 10 or 12 millimeters a year. That's compared to about 3.5 millimeters a year in San Francisco. What's going on is that there's subsidence. And so there's, basically a lot of locations are sinking at up to half an inch a year. And that's potentially a problem. The other really interesting thing, I think, is that it's very spatially variable. So you can be in Antioch and you have less sea level rise than you do in San Francisco, and you cross the Delta, you go 5 or 10 miles, and you might have a very different sea level rise rate. And so I think this is something that managers need to somehow consider, like, how do we actually consider this sort of very spatially heterogeneous sea level rise rate, and how do we actually use predictions of the future plus the subsidence to get a better idea of where the problem areas might be. So next slide, please. There's other things that come out of our analysis. And so in brief, basically there's river flow effects, there's wind effects, there's tide river interaction, there's exports, and also the coastal sea level variability. All of these can be observed in water level records in the Delta. So if you just look, for example, at the river flow, anywhere you see like a yellowish color, that means that river flow is important. As you go to San Francisco, it becomes less important. Exports are actually an important part of the water level in the southwestern Delta. By exports, I mean, pumping into the California Water Project. You can see the coastal processes become less important as you move upstream, but they're still important even in Sacramento, which is also a little bit surprising. And of course, if you've been to the Delta, it's very, very windy. And in the summertime, that can lead to up to about a foot of water level difference. And so all of these things are important and observable in our records. Next slide, please. Next, please.
Sorry, there's a lag. Did it?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, there might be some.
I'm
There
clicking.
might. Yeah, maybe just keep clicking.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't know what's going on, but it's okay.
There. Okay, now it's coming up. There we go.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Okay, good.
So what we also are doing is, with our longer data sets, we can actually look at some of the historical floods, like 1958 or 1969 that happened, and we can evaluate them using the tools of extreme event analysis. That's what you see on the right-hand side. And if you click to the next slide, what we've done with that is we've projected forward in time using knowledge of the local levee heights, or in Rio Vista, just like the level of the streets, and sea level rise scenarios, and the subsidence that's happening locally, and our 100-year flood level. And we can figure out at what point in the future will the 100-year flood level exceed a certain datum, like the levee crest. And what you see is that sort of in the eastern Delta, there's not really an issue. So the yellow and the orange coloring means yeah, that's a long way into the future, according to this projection. But if you look at the heart of the delta, especially along the San Joaquin, there are places where the levee height, as measured by LIDAR in 2017, is not that much different than the 100-year flood level. And, and so again, the main point here is that there's the spatial variability in the sea level rise rates plus the spatial variability in the levee heights means that you have a very spatially heterogeneous management issue. So next slide, please. So can you click through a few times here? This also has one of those animations. Just a little bit more. Yeah, so anyway, so when we look at the Sacramento, that's the upper right figure, you can see there's actually a lot of freeboard. So the blue coloring means subsidence, and that's between two different LIDAR surveys. And so you can see there's a lot of sinking going on that's consistent with what the tide gauges show. But the water level surface is quite a bit below that, and that's that solid line. And so it's that's a very interesting thing, right? So why are the levees much higher in the Sacramento? Well, that's historical. That's because during the gold rush, water levels used to be higher there. Once the river got dredged, water levels decreased. When you go to the San Joaquin, the story is different, especially sort of in the heart of the delta, like Venice Island. And you can see that's, again, you see these problems. The red dots, that is places where there's levee improvements over time where things are being raised up. So next slide, please. And so in terms of the science action agenda, how are we doing on this project? Well, I think we've addressed a lot of issues. I think there's more to do. We've shown that there's variable subsidence, and that has something to do with how the system's being managed. One of the main hotspots of subsidence is where the natural gas extraction is going on near Rio Vista. I haven't seen that really mentioned before as an issue. We have hypotheses that dredging, other sort of developments are actually important in terms of the water levels. Changing river flow is also an issue. There are various things that we can still do. We are in the process of getting some of this data published, and so that'll be available in the next year. And I also have a student that's going to be working on how will habitat change as water levels shift. And we know that, say, marshland is, can drown if the water level gets too high, or if it's high and dry, then it turns into an upland. So long-term shifts in these water levels actually impact habitat as well. So next slide, please. I think the main thing here that I want to just reiterate is, how vulnerable the delta is. And so if we look at the farmland, it's often 20 feet underneath water levels. And so when there is a levee break, it's pretty catastrophic. The replacement cost, is in the tens of billions of dollars. And yet, when people look at what will be the cost of climate change and sea level rise, the delta is often not included in those projections. So there was a recent article that was looking at what will be the cost in San Francisco Bay of sea level rise, and it's around $100 billion, but the delta is not really included in that calculus. And so that's something that I think that this project hopefully highlights, that you really need to think about the bay and the delta as one system. So next slide, please. So yeah, just to summarize again, just to bring it home, the largest sea level rise rates in the entire state are actually in the delta. And a lot of what we see in terms of vulnerability has to do with the history of levees and the history of water levels. They were built to a system that doesn't really exist anymore. The late 19th century system was clogged by gold mining debris, and that is not the case anymore. And so there's some places that have some freeboard and other places that do not. Click forward, please. Also, I think, and maybe this is something that everybody knows on this call, but I really want to advocate that Sacramento and especially Stockton be considered to be coastal cities, even though they're so, they're in the Central Valley and it's really hot in the summer, and yet you do get that sea breeze coming in, and you also get that with the water. And so when we're thinking about management and how to, projecting forward in time, we do need to think about them as coastal cities, also affected by changes to river flow and precipitation. Next, click forward, please. I hope that I've shown that actually having these old records is actually really, really important, for a lot of different reasons, both for evaluating extremes, for knowing what the sensitivity of the delta is to different perturbations, different management type of actions, and so on. We know, for example, now that the pumps in the southwestern delta actually depress water levels by up to 1 foot. And that's important if, for example, one does a delta bypass and one doesn't have that anymore. That means sea level will rise in those areas. Next slide, please. So some sort of scientific recommendations. Again, I've already mentioned this. It's one system, right? The bay and the delta, and arguably going upstream. Click forward, please. I think we need more data. I think it's great that there are these 100 modern data sets for just for water level, but you can see that variability is very heterogeneous, and I don't know if we're actually capturing it yet. Click forward, please. And one way that you can get at that is through more LiDAR surveys, putting in differential GPS to measure land motion and so on. I think that needs to be done. Next, click forward, please. And one of the implications of such variable sea level rise is that maybe one needs to have really ultra local plans. Just looking at a projection at San Francisco isn't going to cut it. We also need to think about the gradients, right, between river flow, river influence and coastal influence, and that can be very, very sharp. Going from Rio Vista to Isleton, you have a very big difference in the effects of river flow just over that very small distance. Click forward, please. I think one needs to think about timescales. I think if we think about construction and project timescales, if those are 10 or 20 years, in some places we may not have that amount of time, in other places we do, right? So I think there's this interaction between how we manage the system and what the physical dynamics of the system are saying. And then, just a sort of personal thing, I feel like we need to educate more students to know how to deal with this kind of stuff. So next. And that's it. So hopefully I didn't take too long. Hopefully there are questions. So thank you very much.
Yes, there are lots of questions, Stefan, because it was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. And great graphics. I'm glad this is being recorded so that people can take a look at this later. Yeah, we can just move forward with some of the questions here. I will go to these questions before I ask mine. So let's go to, it gets at the sort of the fine scale. This one is from Denise Colombano, who is also in the Delta Science program. She asks, your map shows the highest sea level rise rates in Western Suisun Marsh along Suisun Slough. What do you think influences this pattern? Parentheses, there is less subsidence there compared to the Delta.
I don't know. That's a great question. We tried our best. We were very careful about our quality assurance, but it is possible that there are some management things that could be affecting those gauges that we didn't catch. It's also, there could be unacknowledged, groundwater pumping or things of that nature that are happening that could be causing subsidence that hasn't been noticed there. So yeah, that's a great question, and we don't know the answer to that. We do think in Rio Vista that and around there that there's a lot of natural gas extraction going on, and if you actually drive to Rio Vista, you'll see that a lot of the telephone poles are askew. They're kind of, and that is evidence of subsidence, I think. And so that's something that was very interesting that came out of our work. And then, yeah, there's various other places. So I think there can be local causes that are causing some of this local variability. And yeah, it's a great question. And it would be great to have have people look into it more.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, to that end, I also was wondering about the slower rates than at the Golden Gate, the slower rates in the South Delta. Is that some sort of a seismic? I mean,
Yes. Yeah. So there's definitely some plate tectonics going on as well. And it's very interesting. If you go from San Francisco across the bay to Alameda, they have sea level rise rates that are different by 10 centimeters a century. And that is plate tectonics, right? That's, it's less in Antioch, for example, I think because of the plate tectonics. So, yeah.
Great. Okay, so let's keep going. We have a full 15 minutes. Was there somebody else was unmuted? No. Okay, let's keep going then. So we have another question from Aaron Mullen asking, did you about the broadness of your team? So for example, did you coordinate with Joel Dudas at Department of Water Resources, who has also cleaned up stream gauge data?
No, we haven't. And that's a great, that would be a great person to interact with. It's sometimes hard to know who to contact at DWR because it's such a big organization. So we did work with some of the people that are in charge of the gauges, and that's how we got access to their library and found some of the missing data. But one of the ironic things about the data that we found is that it's all computer printouts. And so there was a computer database at some point that has been lost over time from like 1975 to 1982. And so we've had to, reconstruct that based off of printouts.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Looks like Erin has a follow-up, and so I'm going to promote her to chime in here. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I would strongly encourage you. I mean, it sounds like you may have done some of the same work that Joel did. So, basically, so there is a water surface elevation, kind of like this blessed at hydrology for the Delta called the 92 Special Study.
Okay.
That was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. And Joel Dudas has been working for over a decade to update those water surface profiles. And one of the things he started with was digging into the historical record and really cleaning up all the stream gauges. So as I'm sure you're aware, the datum actually changed during this course of record. So it went from like nav 29 to whatever. So I mean, even just adjusting the datum and pulling out just pulling out all of the noise and really cleaning up the record to then use it as in their analysis to project what we think the 100-year what the flood of record should be given this updated data. So if you haven't coordinated with him, I think it might be good or interesting
Yes.
to talk. So I mean, like, this data has now been given over to the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're using it to update the water surface elevations in the Delta. And so, I mean, I think it would be useful to kind of compare and contrast and maybe, like proof your results against what other people have against the work that other people have done. So.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And we are aware of the datum shifts. One of the tricky things is that sometimes there are datum shifts that are not necessarily in the official record. So we've been doing a lot of buddy gauge checking. It would be super interesting to if you could send me his email or do a virtual introduction. I think that would be super useful. And yeah, I think there is some interpretation that has to happen with any of these records, and because they often were a little bit orphaned for a long time, and so so that's we're totally in the weeds of that, and it would be great to compare our evaluation with theirs.
Yeah, I will. I'll follow up. I'll connect you to I'll do an introduction. I think it would be, really great to just kind of, like validate both of your work, given that it's independently.
Exactly. And there are some missing data sets even from like 1982 to the present, where it was measured for a while and then it's not available online, but I know that someone must have a digital copy. So yeah, it's there's a lot of moving parts, and it's really, yeah, the data, empirical data is really important. So yeah, sounds good.
Great, thanks.
Let's continue that theme. There's a question that came in from Norman Johns. It says, on the QA/QC efforts at a fine scale, do the historical written records accurately affect expected tidal cycles, such as expected neaps and spring tides, king tides, things like that?
Yeah. So that's one of the things that we check, right? So we can check water level on different timescales. So what I showed you was sort of on the annual scale, sort of mean water levels. We can check it on a finer scale and look at the spring neap cycles. We can look at cycles over 18 years. There's on a lot of different timescales. There's a lot of things going on. I didn't get into it, but in our we have a physics-based regression model that we've been applying. And that is actually also so basically, it's, if you're familiar with what a rating curve is, it's kind of like that. That's basically river flow versus water level. But then you add in a bunch of other forcing factors, including coastal variability and wind effects and sea level rise. And that is actually also a good way of identifying stations or periods of time where you're not really getting what you expect. And sometimes there's actually there's an actual explanation for it, such as the DWR puts up temporary dams in the southern delta every year, and sometimes it has happened at False River, sort of towards the western delta. And so sometimes there's an actual sort of management imprint that's happening. We see the same thing in sort of if we go close to where the intakes are to Clifton Court, we see a decrease in the tidal range between the 1960s and 1970s, and that's probably also a real signal. So yeah, it's a challenge sometimes to figure out, well, what's just the gauge misbehaving and what is an actual signal. But we have enough data that we can actually sort of verify if we see a correlated signal in a lot of places, that's probably a real signal.
Great. I am looking at some of these questions. I'm wondering, should we, Dylan, do you want to elevate people to ask their question? For example, Henry DeBay has a question, or I should just read it?
If he wants to, he totally can. Feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to promote you to speak your question.
Okay.
I think probably just read it out.
Okay. Well, let me go, in case Henry wants to speak up, I'll go to another talk, which was a question from Malta Wilmus, which fascinating talk. Do you have any plans to further extend the time series back in time? Are there older records or any other archives available pre-1900, for example?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I actually just found at the State Archives a daily water level data set at Mossdale, which is near Stockton, from 1873 to 1886. And that was the history there is that was the last link in the Transcontinental Railroad to be built. And they actually then did water level measurements there. And you can see in the data that we've digitized that the response of the water level to river flow was very different back then. And we also have that for Sacramento, going back to the 1850s. We actually did do a paper 10 years ago, and 8 years ago, looking at historical river flow in the 1800s, also as measured by the tide gauge in San Francisco. And that showed a very interesting thing, which is that river flow was maybe 20–30% more in the 1800s than it is now, at least according to this analysis. And so, yeah, we definitely are interested in going further back in time You see the gold rush effects. There are sparse tide records at various stations like Benicia and Collinsville, Rio Vista, going further back in time. Even Sacramento has a 2-week data set from 1857. And so those aren't necessarily good for water levels, but they do get at how have tides shifted. And tides are kind of like a canary in the coal mine. If your tides are changing, that means your hydrodynamics are changing in other ways as well. And so, you know, there's this is a really broad topic, and the Delta is super complicated, super interesting with all of its waterways and all the different ways that water can get around. And so it's not an easy question, but yeah, we're definitely plan on using some of that data, and then also doing numerical modeling to look forward into the future. You know, what can we expect?
Great. Okay, I'm gonna ask one more question, just looking forward into the future a bit. Can you speculate on how these results could inform large projects, which might be tidal wetland restoration in Suisun or the Delta Conveyance Project, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that one needs to consider the whole system if you're doing something, right? Like if you're doing the Delta Conveyance, it will influence water levels somewhere, right? And you know, if you're taking water from the Sacramento, that means that you're lowering water levels in Rio Vista potentially, but raising them in the southwest corner. So that needs to be considered, right? If you do a lot of wetland restoration, the sum total of that will also affect the system, right? Like, you know, maybe not an individual few acres here and there, but you know, in the sum it will. And then projecting forward in time, there need to be metrics of, you know, how much will inundation shift, you know, like how will your tide datums shift, and how will that affect habitat? And so on the Columbia River, we've actually done this already, like looking at how does shallow water habitat shift as you have changing conditions, right? Changing tides and sea level and so on. And so this approach, like looking at the number of hours a year, for example, that you're inundated, or the number of hours a year that you're shallow water habitat, and how that changes with shifting conditions, that I think is something really interesting that one could do in the Delta as well. And it also requires some ecological knowledge, you know, so, you know, like, okay, well, what are the, you know, where does high marsh begin or low marsh begin in terms of the tide datums, and how does that vary, you know, throughout the Delta? It's not going to be the same in a place which is really river influenced, like the Yolo bypass area, versus, you know, say like Suisun Marsh. So that's places where I could see also interaction with some of the, you know, some of the ecologists and people who know more about plants than me. But I think water levels really are fundamental in sort of driving, you know, it's one of the big things. I mean, sediment input is another one, you know, and water temperature. So these sort of very basic baseline things are actually really, really important for understanding also whether wetland restoration is it going to do what it wants, what we think it should do in 30 years? If you're building in a place with a lot of subsidence, maybe you need to plan that in.
Yeah, thank you for that excellent Talke. I'm sure you have had many puns with your name, but we really enjoyed it. The only time I've ever seen this kind of data is in Louisiana, where they have a lot of that variability through the coastwide reference monitoring system. And I think you brought to the fore that it is variable here as well. So thank you so much. I think we're ready to move to the next talk.
And also really quick, we'll add the last 2 questions and see if Stefan can answer those in the chat for us. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's move forward with Sean Baumgarten. He's here today from San Francisco Estuary Institute, and the title of the talk will be Suisun Landscapes: Science to Understand Historical Changes and Plan a Resilient Future that Reflects Community Priorities. We are really excited about this talk, Sean. Thank you. It addresses both the Science Action Agenda topic of investing in assessing human dimensions of natural resource management, as well as developing tools and methods to support and evaluate habitat restoration. So we can prompt Sean's slides there. Great. And do we have you, Sean?
Yep, I'm here.
Wonderful. Thank
Great.
you.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa Marie. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here with you today. So I'm Sean Baumgarten. I'm an environmental scientist in the Resilient Landscapes program at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And we'll be talking about our Suisun Landscapes project, which aims to expand tools available for adaptation planning in Suisun Marsh. Next slide, please. So I want to start by thanking the Delta Stewardship Council for funding the project and acknowledge the many technical and management advisors listed here who provided helpful guidance throughout the course of the project. Next slide, please. And also want to thank the members of our community working group who have shared valuable input about community priorities for future management. Next slide. So I'm going to start by providing some brief background about project goals and research approach, and then I'll highlight some key results and wrap up with a brief discussion of some management applications and future research directions. Next slide, please. So the impetus for this project came from some basic questions about the historical landscape of Suisun Marsh and how it's changed over time. You can click through, I think, the next three. These included what landscape scale ecological patterns and physical processes characterized Suisun Marsh historically, how has the Suisun Marsh landscape changed over time, and what have been the impacts of these changes on support for native wildlife and other ecological functions, and what are the current priorities of local stakeholders and community partners for natural resource management in Suisun Marsh. Next slide, please. So the overall goals of the project were to expand the currently available tools for adaptation planning in Suisun to include information about historical function and condition of the marsh, how it's changed over time, and community priorities, and to increase capacity to estimate and track the effects of projects in Suisun. Next slide, please. So the project involved four main components: a historical ecology investigation, a landscape change assessment, community engagement, and updates to the landscape scenario planning tool. In the historical ecology investigation, we synthesized a wide array of primary archival data sources to generate a spatially explicit and quantitative understanding of Suisun's historical ecology, including both landscape patterns and processes. In the landscape change assessment, we developed quantitative spatial metrics to evaluate how the ability of the Suisun landscape to support desired ecosystem functions and services has changed over time, and to lay the foundation of knowledge to evaluate opportunities to restore lost function. In the community engagement task, we met with members of a community working group to gather information about community priorities for Suisun Marsh, including current uses of the landscape and perceived future challenges. And then finally, we're integrating the results of the other project components into the landscape scenario planning tool, which I'll discuss more at the end of the presentation. And so this research lays the foundation for future projects to evaluate the potential to restore lost ecosystem functions and enhance the resilience of Suisun Marsh to climate change and other stressors. Next slide, please. So this approach was modeled off of similar work that SFEI led in the Delta through the Delta Landscapes project. And in that project, we started by looking at past landscape conditions and analyzing how the landscape has changed over time, and then combine that with an understanding of how things are expected to change in the future to identify strategies for landscape scale, process-based ecological restoration. And it's important to note that an understanding of historical landscape functioning doesn't provide a prescriptive tool for what to restore where, but it grounds restoration planning in an accurate understanding of how the landscape worked historically, and helps us contextualize current management challenges and envision future landscape potential. Next slide, please. So this project addresses 2 of the science action agenda action areas, including developing tools and methods to support and evaluate habitat restoration and investing in assessing the human dimension of natural resource management challenges. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the results of our historical ecology and landscape change analyses, including overall changes in landscape patterns, as well as some specific metrics of landscape change. Next slide, please. So the map on the left here shows the historical Suisun Marsh landscape, representing average ecological conditions in the marsh in the early 1800s, just prior to major European and American modification of the landscape. And it's based on synthesis of hundreds of different historical sources, including early maps and surveys, like this Coast Survey map from 1866, aerial and landscape photographs, botanical records, and textual accounts. And each feature in the map is coded with supporting sources and certainty levels. So prior to European colonization, Suisun and surrounding areas were inhabited by Patwin, Ohlone, and Bay Miwok tribal groups who used the marsh for subsistence hunting and fishing and foraging. Historically, Suisun supported extensive tidal brackish emergent wetlands, which are shown in green, interwoven with a dense network of mostly shallow subtidal and intertidal channels, shown in blue and brown, respectively. Grizzly Bay and other shallow open water bays bordered the marshes in the southern part of the study area. The main sloughs, like Montezuma Slough, connected, forming large islands of tidal wetland, whereas smaller dendritic channel networks terminated within the marshes. The composition and structure of the marsh varied along an east-west salinity gradient, and also between different geomorphic settings. There were a large number of marsh pans and ponds, which are shown in pink, that existed primarily in the more saline western portions of the marsh. And then the tidal marsh graded into seasonally inundated transition zone habitats like vernal pool complexes and wet meadows and alkali seasonal wetland complexes, which are shown in light greens with stippling. The next slide, please. So this shows a slightly simplified version of the historical habitat mapping on the left and the modern habitat mapping on the right. The modern landscape is still predominantly wetland, but much of the former tidal marsh areas are now levied, and many of these diked seasonal wetlands are now managed for waterfowl hunting. These wetland areas are interspersed with patches of agriculture and bare ground and open water. The largest remnant patches of tidal marsh are located at sites like Rush Ranch and Hill Slough Wildlife Area, Peytonia Slough Ecological Reserve, Roe and Ryer Islands, and along the margins of tidal channels. Next slide, please. So this bar chart quantifies the overall change in area of habitat or land cover types in the study area. Historical is on the left and modern is on the right. And you can click through a few clicks. So some of the biggest overall changes have been loss of tidal wetlands and tidal open water area, 82% and 22% loss respectively. Much of that loss has been driven by diking of former tidal marsh to create managed non-tidal wetlands. So non-tidal emergent wetland and open water combined now occupy 33% of the study area. In addition, 7% of the study area is classified as barren and 5% is either urban or agriculture/rural. And there's also been substantial loss of 2 seasonal wetland types, vernal pool complex and alkali seasonal wetland at the upland edge of the marsh. Next slide, please. So in addition to looking at overall changes in habitat extent and distribution, We also developed a number of quantitative spatial metrics to assess the impacts of changes in landscape patterns and processes on key ecosystem functions. So key functions were identified with input from the advisory teams and community representatives, and include waterbird support, marsh wildlife support, fish support, transition zone wildlife support, subsidence mitigation, and migration space. And so this slide shows the quantitative spatial metrics and their associated ecosystem functions. And none of these metrics tell the whole story. And so we did additional qualitative analysis of historical and modern data to assess changes in functions not fully captured by these spatial metrics. So I'll highlight results from several of these metrics. Next slide, please. So the first metric illustrates the impacts of marsh fragmentation. The maps show marsh core areas in green versus edge areas in orange, with edge defined as areas within 50 meters of the edge of a marsh patch. So areas of a marsh patch close to its outer edge, of course, generally experience different biotic and abiotic conditions than areas within its core. For example, they tend to be more accessible to predators. They're less buffered from human disturbance. And so for this analysis, we included both tidal marsh and managed seasonal wetlands. And you can see that there's been a dramatic reduction in the core to edge ratio in these wetlands. In the historical landscape on the left, 83% of the marsh was core area, while in the modern landscape on the right, only 23% of the marsh is core area. Next slide, please. So the second metric illustrates changes in inundation regimes, which are key drivers of plant and wildlife patterns, as well as other processes and functions. So the map on the left, based on our historical habitat mapping, shows that much of Suisun historically experienced regular tidal inundation, with areas of seasonal inundation in the upland transition zone. In comparison, Suisun Marsh today is dominated by non-tidal seasonal wetlands and waterfowl ponds, with patches of remnant and restored tidal marsh and levied areas that remain dry throughout the year. So for species dependent on intact tidal marshes like Ridgway's rail, the widespread conversion of tidal marshes to managed seasonal wetlands and the fragmentation of the remaining marsh habitat has meant a dramatic reduction in habitat extent, quality, and connectivity. However, unlike in the Delta, much of Suisun Marsh is still wetted on a seasonal basis. And these managed seasonal wetlands provide important food resources for many waterbird species, particularly those that utilize shallow ponds and managed wetlands. Managed wetlands also can also provide substantial food web benefits for fish, although the relative benefits of tidal marshes versus managed wetlands for native fish are not well understood and likely depend on specific management practices. And native fish populations in Suisun have been in decline due to a combination of habitat loss, invasive species, altered flow regimes, and water quality changes. Next slide, please. So another important process that has transformed the Suisun landscape is elevation change, driven by several processes. So the map on the left here shows changes in elevation since the early 1800s, based on a reconstructed historical digital elevation model that was created for a previous project. Much of the region has lost elevation, as shown in teal and blue. In the diked managed wetlands, subsidence has been driven by oxidation of peat in the absence of regular inundation. And then the map on the right shows areas currently gaining elevation in orange, losing elevation in blue, or maintaining current elevations in gray. So you can see that an estimated 36,000 acres, or about 34% of the study area, is actively losing elevation. And subsided areas are, of course, at increased risk from sea level rise. If levees fail, many subsided areas will be inundated and may become subtidal open water habitat. So subsidence reversal actions like tidal marsh restoration or construction of floating peat wetlands could be considered in currently subsided or actively subsiding areas. Next slide, please. So I want to wrap up with a few thoughts about management applications and future research directions. Next slide, please. So this work has provided spatial data sets and foundational information about historical landscape functioning, landscape change, and community priorities. And one of the main ways we're making this available is through the landscape scenario planning tool. So this is a GIS tool designed to help managers and land use planners in Suisun and the Delta compare the effects of different land use scenarios on a range of desired functions for ecosystems and people. So for a given set of scenarios, the tool runs a set of spatially explicit analyses relating to various ecosystem functions and outputs a set of data files and detailed reports that enable users to compare how scenarios perform relative to one another and to the historical and existing landscapes. The tool is free and available for downloads. Anyone can reproduce these analyses for their own scenarios. And we're currently making a number of updates to integrate findings from this project into the existing tool. Next slide, please. So we'll be completing updates to the tool later this year and also publishing our research in a peer-reviewed manuscript and a manager-oriented report. And ultimately, the intention is for the scenario planning tool and the information developed in this project to be used along with other data sets, for example, related to primary productivity or salinity dynamics, to develop restoration visions and map out landscape potential. And as we did in the Delta, future phases of this work could focus on developing multi-benefit process-based restoration strategies to support desired ecosystem functions and land uses. And we know that Suisun Marsh, although it's highly modified and faces enormous challenges, also has enormous potential to support resilient biodiverse ecosystems and provide many benefits to local communities. Next slide, please. So I want to again thank the Delta Stewardship Council for funding and supporting this research. You can find more information on the Suisun Landscapes project website and the Landscape Scenario Planning Tool website. And I'm happy to take questions, and also wanted to pose a discussion question, which is for developing restoration visions that build on this foundation, what are some key elements that should be included or alternatives that could be assessed? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for that discussion question too. And I really invite you all to chime in with some more questions for Sean. I think I'll start with one quick question. Just to frame this, the historical ecology work that SFEI did for the Delta was just fundamental in the way it allowed, different scenario exploration. And so I'm curious, what you actually have learned through if we step into the third of your 4 goals, the community engagement, what did you actually learn from the community engagement that we could use to help understand adaptive management options or better interpretation of the data that we do have?
Yeah, so we convened the community working group in order to better understand community priorities for the marsh and bring in perspectives that wouldn't necessarily be represented by the traditional management and science communities. So we heard a number of priorities and ideas. There was a lot of desire for habitat restoration and sort of more support for native plants and wildlife. A lot of concern about climate change and how to adapt, to sea level rise and increased salinities and temperatures and other impacts. Concern about other threats like invasive species. Also, we heard, a desire for more kind of equitable access and, kind of proactive management that crosses over property boundaries. A lot of the marsh is in private ownership, so a desire for more sort of management that sort of aligns across the the different property boundaries. And I would say there were some key groups that we weren't able to engage as in this project that would be important to bring into future conversations, I think, about marsh management and restoration.
Sorry, I was gonna say phase 2. I'm glad you laid that out. So yeah, there's lots of places to go from here. Let's go to some of the questions in the chat. The ones that come up are often about the mapping. So for example, Denise Colombano asks, what happened to all of the freshwater creeks? They were lost due to soil compaction from cattle. For example, the freshwater creeks draining into the western marsh on the other side of 680, Highway 680.
Yeah, so that is just a mapping artifact. So in the landscape change analysis, we were really focusing on habitat change. And so I think the modern map that I displayed was not showing the single line freshwater creek channels draining into the marsh. Definitely there have been changes and a lot of impacts there as well, but our focus on the change analysis was on sort of the habitat patterns.
Got it. That's great to clarify. Okay, so another question is about the large loss of open water. This is from Norman Johns. What accounts for the large loss of open water from the historical reconstruction to modern in the northeast portion of Grizzly Bay?
Yeah, so that was largely driven by hydraulic mining debris from the gold rush. So and you can see that sort of progression of impacts starting in the early Coast Survey maps from the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and just a steady kind of progression of first the mud flats and then the tidal marsh there in the northeastern side of Grizzly Bay. So yeah, that is while much of the marsh has subsided and lost elevation, there are areas that have accreted, and particularly those that portion of Grizzly Bay as a result of hydraulic mining.
Yeah, my question to go along with that was all the tidal marsh, the emergent marsh was coded the same, but that's more of like a century-old marsh, I guess we call it, or 150-year-old, and then there's the Holocene marshes. Is there a reason you guys didn't just separate new marsh from historically old marsh in your classifications?
No, there is not a particular reason. I think that's something we could have done, but just our classification system, we ended up lumping all the tidal emergent wetland into a single class.
That's fine, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, do you have a couple more questions? This one is from Ben Geske. Is Ben live? Do you want to ask your question live, Ben? I'll go ahead and ask Ben's question then. Did you approach any of this work through the lens of coupled human and natural systems? I'm the CHANS framework. I'm wondering if there would be a benefit to displaying some of these results in a manner that would highlight connections, interactions between the human activities and the naturally occurring scenarios.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that framework, so maybe you could explain a little bit more. I guess I would say that we did, definitely look into sort of the environmental history as part of the historical ecology research. So it wasn't the primary focus, but definitely trying to, provide that context in terms of both the indigenous management of the marsh and then the land use history over time.
Yep, I think you brought in quite a few of the human components that have been lacking in other assessments. So looking forward to seeing your tool. I'm curious, is there any more questions that I'm missing? Those of you who are monitoring the chat?
Yeah, there's one from Denise, and I just go ahead, Denise.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, this is so great. I love this presentation. I love seeing the maps, and I can't wait to use them and really dig into your analysis. I'm familiar with Amber Manfree's work. that she did maybe about 10 years ago is a historical ecology assessment. And then I think that it ended up in a book, Envisioning Futures for Suisun Marsh. I was the report name. Anyways, I was curious, are the data inputs different? Are the results different than what she found? And if so, what else did you learn?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I will say that was certainly a key reference for us. And there's just a huge wealth of information that Amber and colleagues had compiled as part of that research. So that was definitely something that we were trying to build on. And I think that the the work that we were doing was more sort of focused on providing spatial data, so the GIS mapping and layers to then feed into this kind of spatial landscape change analysis. And so but I think a lot of the sort of basic information about landscape patterns and composition and structure and land use history was similar to what Amber and colleagues had found in that work.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing the web tool. So is it like, I think maybe until I see another question, is it live and able to be explored right now?
It is. Yeah, so this research we haven't fully integrated into the tool yet. There is a version of the Suisun Marsh mapping and the various analysis modules that is live and can be used. That was based on some work several years ago, but yeah, this latest research will be integrated by the end of the year.
Great. And I think one last question then towards that is what critical information or data are missing, if any, that should be collected now to inform future adaptive planning and quantitative measurements?
Yeah, I think the slide I showed of the metrics and functions, I think those are some of the key elements that we felt like we had the data to do spatial analysis, but there certainly are other questions that we weren't able to address as part of this research. I think one big one is kind of questions around primary productivity and how that varies across the marsh, how primary productivity in tidal marshes compares with managed wetlands, and how much of that is exported to channels and available for fish and other wildlife. I think similarly, we didn't do any sort of spatial quantitative analysis of salinity regimes, obviously a key driver of a lot of ecological patterns in Suisun Marsh. And so, we did a lot of kind of qualitative data synthesis around that, but I think that would be another future research direction, would be to try to develop and analyze more spatially the salinity patterns.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I think, yeah, you have a large team of interested people that maybe can join that effort as well. Thank you, Sean.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we will go ahead. Oh, yeah, I think we're set to, I think, move into our closing slide, unless Jill or Dylan tell me otherwise.
That's everything.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, we're I'm trying to I'm not so quick on the trigger. Here we go.
Great, thank you. All right, we will be closing then out today. I think these questions can continue to be answered. You're having an exit poll here. We do really want to engage feedback from you on how to structure these in the future, and hear your thoughts on the topics that we covered today. Again, from social and historical perspectives. I really want to thank Stefan Talke and Sean Baumgarten for taking the time to give such detailed slides of the implications of their work, not just what they did, but why it matters. So again, this is recorded and will be available on the YouTube site for the Delta Stewardship Council. To plug next week's talk, this is going to be going on for the next 6 weeks. We have the same time slot, and if you register via Zoom, you can be invited to all of them. Next week's seminar is on migratory fishes, science tools to inform management and recovery. And the 2 talks will be by Malte Wilmes and by Alexander Forrest. The first being the effects of climate change on the life history of spring run Chinook salmon through time. And the second will be regulation of controls of cold water through the temperature control device of the Shasta Dam as a means of supporting downstream fish populations. So,
And I'll just quickly, sorry, this is Maria, jump in, quickly share that these are the themes for the rest of the summer, the weekly seminars for the rest of the summer. So join us for all of them.
beautiful. Thank you for that. Any last questions or plugs for data or sorry, project results from these talks or others? Nope. Then I think we will close out and continue the conversation offline. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'll just let it run for like 2 more minutes and then I can end it.
Thanks, Eva.
Great. I think you can actually probably end it now. I think that'll be.
Boy, those were good questions.